Morning, everyone. Again, by way of quick introduction, my name is Srikanth Tadikonda. Um, in terms of education, I'm a CPA. I'm also done CMA from India. Um, and I have more than 20 years experience in the banking and financial services industry, mainly servicing the American clients, US clients, and most of my work experience is also related to US taxation. I was part of the Global Shared Services Bangalore, Ernst& Young. Um, and also my first job, interestingly, was with a venture capital kind of setup where we have helped by providing functional support build a tax product, right? An online tax product for individual tax returns, American, US individual tax returns, right? So that's a quick introduction, and let's just get let's set the ball rolling, right? Um, so as you all know, today is a demo class, for the enrolled agent course. And before I get into the sort of a mini class kind of thing, right? Just to give you guys a flavor in terms of how the teaching methodology is going to be, whether it's going to be interactive or not, and so that you get some sense in terms of the whole what to expect out of Simandar Education, and in terms of whom we are collaborating with. That's the Fast Forward Academy, one of the top two review programs for the enrolled agent exam, right? So before we get there, let me quickly spend a few minutes, right? And I will definitely take pause. It's a little bit into the once I start explaining about EA, but feel free to use the chat window to shoot any question you guys have, right? Okay, so the agenda I'm going to cover today is mainly in terms of, right, we're going to see all the basics in terms of what is EA, why investing in EA makes sense, and for whom it makes sense, how to become an enrolled agent. So some details about the exam, the format, schedule, and also what to expect, as I said, in terms of from us, right, to help you get to the success path. And then we'll have one topic covered from the individual taxation in the mini class. Okay. Starting off with what I'm sure all of you here would know about it already. So enrolled agent is someone, right, who can represent his clients, right? Basically taxpayers, his or her clients before the Internal Revenue Services of the US, right? So basically, they are federally authorized tax practitioners, and yeah, I'm going to cover. I see a question, Arya. Just give me a little bit of time, right? I think the eligibility is getting probably covered in the next few slides. Let's do one thing, right? So we are on slide 3 now. Let me cover till how, right? Probably, and then we can, I'll take a pause. There are more details coming up after that. Okay. So in terms of what first, getting back to the question. So enrolled agent is someone who represents his or her clients, right? That is the taxpayers before IRS. And so basically he's a federally authorized tax practitioner. Note the word federally because this actually comes from the federal government, right? Which is unlike CPA as well, because CPAs usually are registered at the state level and they have their own rules in terms of how they can practice, what is the eligibility, the continuing education and stuff, right? But EA comes it's sort of, because it's an IRS run course, and sort of it is governed by IRS. It sort of is a federally it's a federal thing in nature, right? And in terms of even the representation is sort of unlimited in scope, so just doesn't relate to only tax preparation or tax consultation, or even representation. An enrolled agent can also represent his client in terms of audits, in terms of the refund matters, collection actions, appeals, is pretty much the entire scope. You can pretty much do everything, right? And especially become an agent for for the taxpayer per se. Yeah, I think this is the basic stuff, right? And then little bit more just to give a highlight, just to highlight enrolled agent versus rest of the, say, the professional, professionals who can also work on taxes per se or represent their clients. So as we already talked about, EA sort of is licensed by the federal government, right? It's an yes here in the first column. And then obviously, someone aspiring to be enrolled agent must pass a comprehensive tax exam. It's called C. We'll see in terms of, what is SCE. And then do they have full representation rights before IRS? Yes. And it is a specialization in taxes, in taxes. And also it does require some continuing education hours, right? Specifically on taxation, ethics, etc. Again, which we'll cover, a quick snapshot in the following slides. I guess till here probably I think you guys probably would have a good idea already, but just to instead of diving into the exam, right? And why part of it, again, right, it's definitely a rewarding path in terms of it opens up new avenues, new doors, in the careers, especially if someone is from accounting background. Might not have too many other certifications. So EA definitely is a good bet, because it increases the earning potential as well, right? And to give you context in terms of, especially in India, I don't know, I would assume most of you probably are not looking to probably work in US job market per se. So in India, right, again, as I said, in 2002, way back in 2002, when Ernst & Young started their tax practice in Bangalore, I was part of that group there, right? So they've been doing it for close to 20 years now. Deloitte has a huge operations and practice in Hyderabad. EY has in other places as well, right? In NCR region, I think. And there are a couple of other places as well, right? Within India per se. And more interestingly, at least in my view, right, it's definitely a low investment in terms of your time, in terms of your efforts, and also in terms of the money per se, right? In terms of how much you need to spend, how much you need to spend on the exam, on the examination fees, including review courts, etc. But at the same time, it gives you a much higher value add, right? And just to, again, right, this was one of the questions asked in one of the previous demos. The pass percentage, right? It has got 3 different parts. Again, I think we'll look at the exam later. It varies for each part. Especially part 2, which is more in terms of business, all the taxation rules for businesses. That's supposed to be more tough. So the percentage is lower for that, and part 3 is more of procedural, that is higher. But overall, right, if you look at the overall pass percentage of enrolled agent exam, it is around 70% as per the most current average, right? What is the latest that got published per se, and it definitely is higher than in terms of pass percentage compared to any other professional exams, right? For example, CPA, which is around 40 to 50%. I'm talking about each part separately, right? Even in CPA, if you're talking about clearing everything in one shot, the percentage would be much lower. But CPA or CMA, traditionally they're around 40 to 50% pass rate, and for EA it's much higher. And obviously we talked about it will expand your knowledge. And you'll probably, you're going to, if you already have accounting background, it's a good addition to have in terms of specialization in US taxes, right? Taking a pause here. Yeah, so Arya, right? So in terms of scope, right, I think I probably covered a little bit of it, when I talked about it in this slide, right? In US, obviously, right, it's a big market there in terms of because an EA can actually sign a tax return and sort of file it. There's a huge market there, right? Probably, top of my head, right? I think 40 to 50,000 kind of K per year is what you can earn being an EA. Also, that's a good certification that will get your career started in sort of consulting firms and big four, tax firms and stuff like that, right? And within India again, right? Other than whatever I mentioned in terms of EY and Deloitte, I also worked in Cognizant for more than 12 years, and I know some of the clients I used to manage in BFS space, even though they are sort of more of hedge funds, and we used to help them primarily with fund accounting and administration kind of work. We also used to handle some of their taxes. It's a value chain kind of thing, right? Some of the companies, offshoring, setups here, if they have been working with their client for a long time, usually they do get into the tax areas, right? Like Cognizant does. Depends on the maturity of their client relationship and stuff and all. And we also have done, at Cognizant, we also sort of coordinated with, for example, another big four company as well, right, within India, and the client process. It was a three-way collaboration that we did, and did some review work and kind of stuff. Okay, before I get into how, let me see if there is. Yeah, I think so. The demo, today's class is mainly for enrolled agent guys. I hope you guys got information about that. CPA probably I think will happen later. But yeah, I know some of this one in terms of the scope of this exam and all is mostly covered in the regulation paper of the CPA, right? Though it has got other parts as well. Regulation, one of the papers in CPA, it has got taxation, plus it has got the business law and procedures and a couple of other things, right? But yeah, so the class is going to be mainly about enrolled agent, please. Let me complete how, and then let me take any other questions we have, right? Again, right, the how, at least the way we're going to cover it today in terms of flow, let's understand what it takes, right, in terms of what is the exam, what is the scope, what all is covered kind of stuff. Then in terms of the logistics part of it, everyone who needs to sit for the enrolled agent exam needs to obtain something called PTIN, which is Preparer's Tax Identification Number. We can discuss about these kind of steps later, but surely you will get some guidance in terms of how to go about that, obviously, right, once you start working with us kind of thing, right? Join us for this course and stuff. And then step 3 would be to schedule your exam. So the exam is the EA exam actually has got a name. It's called Special Enrollment Exam or SEE. Obviously, then you prepare for the exam. This is where we come in terms of helping you prepare for your exam, make you practice as many multiple choice questions as we can, review some of the difficult portions more than whatever is required, sort of reinforce some of the concepts, and also help you take some practice exams kind of stuff, right? Again, all this stuff will help you do that, and then obviously you take your exam, and then hopefully you'll clear the exam as well, right? Just as interesting, so that in case you do not know, one person, someone can also become an enrolled agent without writing the exam, right? But I guess we don't really have, probably will not have someone fitting in that category today with us, right, in the class today, because this will involve working with IRS for a specific period, right? I think more than 5 years or so. So if you actually are already working or have completed working with the IRS for 5 years, obviously there are some specific rules as well. Then you can apply, and one can apply and then get certified as enrolled agent, right? But for everyone else, you need to write the SEE exam and stuff and all. The next 3 slides quickly cover in terms of what the exam is going to be, right? Someone has a question on terms of if there are any certification requirements. But let me take a pause here and see if there are any questions. In terms of package, right, Arya? Again, right, honestly, I don't think there'll be a there'll be a direct answer to the question per se, right? Because it depends obviously on in terms of overall candidature, right? In terms of what you are going to offer, your experience, even if you're a fresher, in terms of what you have studied, where you have studied, and basically where you're joining as well, right? So, top of my head, in India per se, I don't think for this class per se I'll be able to give you a specific number. But one thing I can tell you, right? Again, the founder of Simandar Education, right? Who actually manages and runs Simandar, Shripal Jain. He has got good connect with the industry, and especially he keeps interacting with senior executives within EY, Deloitte, and other big four firms or consulting firms. And there's very huge appetite, right, in terms of within these firms, one, to get EA done, right? If they have some senior or old vintage guys kind of stuff, right? People who have already joined them, but who have never, they have not cleared EA exam. There are discussions in terms of, we can do specific training programs for them, right? Because they want their employees to be EAs. These for their existing employees. And two, when they look for the new hires, obviously it will be a big advantage, right? In terms of your negotiations, negotiating ability per se, or in terms of where you get placed, in terms of the levels that a particular organization has, if you clear EA exam, right? Again, think about it, guys. I think if the specific role is about taxation and filing taxes day in day out, they would, any hiring manager, right? If I am a hiring manager, I would love to have someone who has already studied about the exam in depth and has a certification like EA, because obviously my specific training to my client or what kind of work I do becomes much lesser, right? I don't have to invest much of time in that. So just the comfort factor, and say you probably will have a calling card per se, right, to get into, especially big four kind of firms, and firms which pay you well, definitely, right? Probably 30%, 40% more than what other firms can offer, and kind of stuff. Okay. So let's quickly see this, the next three slides, right? It won't take more than 5 minutes, less than 5 minutes. And then let me take the other questions, right? So in terms of how you can ace the CE exam, right? The SCE. The first thing is there are no certification requirements. One of the questions I've got earlier. So again, right, as you guys know, for other professional exams, sometimes there are certain minimum educational requirements you might need, including 16 years of education, a certain amount of work, a certain amount of knowledge in certain subjects and stuff. For EA, there's none. Yeah, and you need to pass all the three parts of exam, right? There are three different parts. You're going to see the details in the second slide from now. And you need to clear all the three within 2 years of registering for the exam, right? And then more in terms of things that happen in the background, or say before you actually become certified, IRS does run a background check kind of stuff to make sure you're clean. Also, if someone is, especially in US, they'll make sure that the person applying for EA, his tax compliance is good, right? That he's been filing tax returns and kind of stuff, right? And also, I think I've covered it earlier. As part of the, once you become EA, you need to have a continuing professional education, which is, the way it is considered is for a block of 3 years, one needs to complete CPE of 72 hours, right? And within that, in each year, there should be a minimum 16 hours of training. So someone should sit for professional conduct or tax training and ethics and all for around 16 hours per year, including 2 hours of ethics. Okay. Those are sort of, more nicer to know stuff, right? Just quickly look on the what the exam is, and then again I'll take questions, right? So basically, in terms of how you schedule your exam, or say, let's start with the exam format first. There are three different parts. Part one is relates to mainly individual taxations, taxation for individuals. Then part two is about taxation for businesses, and then there's a part three where it covers representation in terms of the procedures and practices an EA must do when appearing before IRS, right? More of procedural exam. So in terms of level of difficulty, part three obviously is easier, right? It's not other than understanding what it takes to practice EA. There are not too many rules and theory that you need to remember per se, right? Numbers kind of stuff, right? So that's easier. Part two is supposed to be more difficult, one in terms of the scope per se, and also business tax returns obviously are more complex than what you see in individuals, that is in part one, right? So usually, there are certain exceptions this year because of COVID and how it has disrupted everything else, including examinations. But usually, right? So the window, the testing window of EA exam starts from May of every year and then goes up to February the following year, right? So for example, for this year, 2020, the window opens from May 1st till February 21, right? End of February, Feb 28th, 21. But again, there is some changes. I'll cover that in a subsequent slide, right? For this year, and then each part is sort of the duration for each part is 3.5 hours. There'll be 100 MCQs, all multiple choice questions. Again, just more of an interesting thing. Out of 100, 85 usually are the operative questions, which are the questions that will be considered for your evaluation. Other 15 are usually experimental, right? The way usually it happens in professional exams. Those 15 questions will not give you marks, but they are used in terms of IRS gauges in terms of whether they can be given as operative questions in future exams, right? And then in terms of overall score per se, right? It's a little complicated in terms of how the grading gets done, because but I think simply, right? I think if I need to if I need to tell you sort of the basic rules, right, in terms of the score per se, because I think that's where usually most of the questions come from. The passing score is mainly about is per section is 105 points, right? 105 points. But overall score, right, is sort of calculated by using the number of right answers that you gave over the overall questions in the examination, right? So they do kind of a scaling where the scale might range anywhere between 40 and 130 as well, and then basically they'll come up with your score, right? But very simply, if I can sort of tell you what you need to remember, if you can get 70 to 80% of your questions right, okay, just to be safer, 70 minimum, but 80 will be absolutely great. If you can get 70 to 80% of the questions right in each part, you will basically clear the exam, right? So this is where I think the practice test will come in, where you don't really have to sit for the exam. It's usually not recommended that you sit for the exam unless you are scoring at that level and you feel confident about taking the exam per se, right? And other things I think we covered in terms of the exam window is May 1st to Feb 28th. This year, right, because of COVID, as I mentioned, the testing window in June got cancelled. So next slide is going to give you what are the other testing windows, right? And you obviously, it's a Prometric exam, right? It's an online exam. You can go and take the exam in one of the authorized centers. Again, locations are coming up in the next slide. You need to but register and examination appointment must be scheduled within 1 year, and the latest 2 days prior to the test date, right? Assuming the slots are available. And we talked about carryover of passing score up to 2 years from the exam. So if you clear, say, part 1, right, or part 3, if you take part 3 first, because it's not sequential, you can start with part 3, you can take you can do part one and then you can do part two. It depends on you. So if you take part three first, right, and you clear it, say in August, whatever, right? August 2020, you'll have 2 years from that to clear the other two parts as well, right? So that is the, you can carry your passing score up to 2 years from the date of the first exam per se, right? Again, right, there are certain exceptions in terms of they've given longer carryover period for people who have already cleared at least one part by February 2020, but let's not get there, right? I don't think. Let me know if any of you have already attempted EA earlier, and I'll tell you in terms of right that particular rule per se. And the last, let me just okay. So let me see if there are any questions here, right? Did I cover everything? Yeah. So let me pause and take questions here. Okay, right. So a couple of questions here, right? One, yeah, Manoj, I think the answer to your question is going to come up in the next 3 slides. At least the broad overview, right, in terms of what all taxation you're going to cover in EA. And other question is regarding, if you plan to do CPA after EA, right? Absolutely right. I know a lot of people who do both in one way, right? Again, someone asked me previously, and I didn't really give them like a like this is a guaranteed outcome per se, but definitely right, doing EA will help in one paper, right, greatly, which is regulation, one of the papers for CPA as well. But it's fine, they are not unrelated, right? So EA is focused on taxation, and then CPA is much larger in terms of the accounting and audit. It covers business laws as well, but definitely they are compatible, right? You can do EA and CPA together. The next question I think was, yeah, will it help getting job in MNC? I think I've mentioned it, Pawan, earlier. Absolutely right. Again, based on the conversations Simandar is having currently with industry heads, based on our network, we definitely know that companies who work or who has tax practice, US tax practice, are increasingly looking to hire EA certified people, right? Even within Hyderabad, there are many in Bangalore, NCR, all the big cities, right? Pune, Chennai, including even Gandhinagar kind of stuff, right? So obviously, it will definitely increase your, chances and make your CV stronger per se. The next 3 slides, guys, are more in terms of what we have in terms of the exam, right? Let me quickly walk through that, and then I'll pause for the next set of questions before we start off with the demo class, right? In terms of a taxation topic per se. So again, right? I think there are in certain websites or certain sources even actually do in terms of they have a history in terms of how many questions have been asked from each of these parts, but IRS themselves very clearly gives, right, in terms of weightage, what are the different sections in each part, as well as what is the weightage, right? What are the various sections and what is the weightage in the exam. So in individuals, right, basically it covers preliminary work and taxpayer data, including all the filing status, filing determination, which forms, which schedules need to be used, etc. Then there are income and assets. How do you report that in your tax returns? What are the deductions and credits that one can claim to reduce their overall taxable income? As well as kind of various scenarios where a taxation advice can be given, right? More of a consulting kind of scenarios where you can see the what benefits the taxpayer more, right? And then there are certain specialized returns for individuals, the trust and other things. Don't want to cover the details here, but we can we can look at those specialized returns as well, right? When we cover the individuals topics. Part two, again, right, is a bit more broader in terms of scope. Covers businesses, and then it also covers, so these more of the if someone is doing a sole proprietor, he just does it more like an individual and just runs a business. It could be even a professional service. All that will come within individuals itself. But someone is more like a corporation, what US calls C corporations, that gets covered here, as well as other business forms, right? In terms of partnerships and the 1065s and 1120s and kind of stuff, right? Those are the forms I'm mentioning. So all that get covered in the businesses section, right? So this one is mainly regarding business, their financial information, and again, any specialized details that some of the businesses need to file, right? Again, there is a clear weightage sort of given in terms of how the questions or evaluation will get distributed. And finally, there's more of a in terms of what actually matters in terms of someone working as a EA. They're all topic 3 is in terms of procedures and practices for representation, right? What all is required and what someone needs to do. What are the various types of representation and how do you file, what is the process and kind of stuff, right? So all that gets covered in the last topic. And as just to reinforce once again, there's no sequential order in terms of how someone can sit for the exam. So someone can schedule part 3 first, clear it, if you can get more confidence, and then get to other parts, right, depending on your preference per se, right? I think these are the, okay, let me just pause here, right? Let's see, one more question and then the last 2 slides. Okay, I think Arya again, right, in terms of this sort of personal judgment, right, in terms of double certification and stuff. Obviously CPA is a bit more comprehensive, right? More comprehensive in terms of what it covers, in terms of what it certifies you on. As I said, it covers audit, it covers financial accounting, and other stuff, right? And EA is more focused on tax. Depends on what is your target industry, right? In terms of where you want to end up working. So if you're very clear and you're at a place, or you're more mobile, if you're working more on, you're looking at more specifically at taxes, EA obviously will cover, the taxes part, right? In terms of it gets you, it sort of opens the doors for you to work in good MNCs and big clients, right? All the big 4 firms and all. It's not that CPAs won't be taken into those in those positions. Obviously, as I said, CPAs will also be considered for those roles. But we covered it earlier. CPA is definitely much more wider in terms of scope. Takes much more investment, right? In terms of your efforts, in terms of scheduling the exam, the whole turnaround kind of stuff and everything. Okay. I hope that answers your question, right? Yeah, guys, right? Again, all these are, I think I'm sure we can discuss more as well, right? Let's have more like, I hope we can cover the first portion, right? The first section in the next 5 minutes. But Madhu, right? I think it's not a irrelevant question at all. It's a very good question, but consider that, right? I'm not sure whether you're a fresher or, if you already know about some job market, right? All the scenario, right? And I know it's a very, in terms of the current job market, in terms of currently what industry is going through, it's a tough time, right? But again, from my experience, in terms of, being around for 20 years per se, working in Abu Dhabi, working in India and in various companies, usually this is a good market, definitely, right? To your question in terms of freshers, right? Because most companies look for cutting their cost, right? If possible, wherever possible, without compromising on their quality, their client commitments and whatever, right? So, obviously I think freshers will actually have much more higher opportunities in these cases, because in terms of, from the company's point of view, they come at a lower price, right? For them, the cost is much lower, if they have more number of freshers compared to, other scales of employees, right? So let me just complete the next 2 slides, right? And then we'll have one last round in terms of, but I know this is important, guys. I know most of you will have questions. So I don't mind spending a few more minutes on that. But let me just cover these two slides, right, in terms of the SCE schedule for 2021 as well as what to expect, right? And then before we start off the filing status, one of the classes, the sort of a mini class for today, I will definitely pause and let's discuss more in case you guys have questions. In terms of 2021 schedule, right? As I mentioned earlier, usually there is one testing window, right? There would have been one more column here, June 2020, but that got cancelled. With everything going around currently, and this is an international schedule, by the way, right? If someone is within US, even for them there have been changes this year, and there are there are different sort of more options for them in terms of locations and everything, but this is for the international students. So these are the testing windows, right? Let me start with the locations first. So there are the Prometric sites are there in Hyderabad, Bangalore and New Delhi, and the nearest testing window is in August 2020. These are the various slots we have. I mean, IRS has opened, and again in November there are the schedule, the windows that are open, and also in February, right, 2021. So usually a window starts from May of current year up to February the following year, right? March and April are very peak seasons for, especially for individual tax returns and also for partnership per se. So there won't be any exams conducted during March and April, right? But usually this is a testing window, and this time is there from August to February, right? Again, some questions you might have in mind. Let me just cover it off. Is assuming that we start this course, right? Depends on other factors, and I'm sure we'll keep you guys posted. If we start the course, say within May, right, in the next couple of weeks, pretty much I think there is possibility of you sitting for the August cycle as well, right? Again, I think I'll cover that in terms of how many hours it takes kind of stuff in the next slide. But if that is one of the questions, please hold your thought on that, right? If there are no specific questions on this slide, let me just cover the next one as well. And then I'll get back to you guys, right? So in terms of how we do our course, we have we collaborate with Fast Forward Academy. They're one of the best review courses rated in top 2, overall. They're excellent in terms of analytics, a lot of MCQs and multiple choice questions, which will tell you in terms of while answering them itself, right? We'll get a sense in terms of which sections we are doing well, which sections, we need to focus more. So that gives us good idea in terms of how to focus our classes. The online training, it can obviously be flexible. If required, we can do more hours as well, but we believe 70 to 80 hours of online training. What I do say as part of the course, we currently the plan is to do it on weekends, Saturdays and Sundays. So there'll be around 80 hours of online training as well. And then I would, based on my experience, right, in terms of what I know, probably you'll have to do a matching contribution per se, right? In terms of putting another 70, 80 hours of time from your side. And I think that should be good, right? In terms of clearing the EA exam, right? Again, it varies from individual to individual, guys. I think it is subjective per se, but overall, right? I think around 150 hours, max 200 hours is supposed to be good preparation, right? For taking the EA exam. Okay. And obviously in terms of our methodology, we'll have interactive classes. There'll be examples that we can work out together within class. There'll be a lot of quizzes that we do during classes or even offline as well. And it'll be topic wise MCQs. Again, as I said, that will give us a good idea in terms of where overall class, where it lacks in terms of focus areas, as well as individually it gives you sort of an idea in terms of where you should focus more, right? Once we do MCQs after completing each topic. And then there are practice exams that you can take before you actually go and sit for the exam. Ideally, it is recommended that you take 2 to 3 practice exams. Doing more will give you a false sense of security, because some questions might repeat and you might think as you're done, you're doing great. Doing lesser obviously will not give you confidence, right? So yeah, I think ideally you'll take say 3 practice exams, right? And this is what you can expect with our course. So these all I have as in terms of the overall, in terms of overview of the EA exam, right? The what, why, and how part of it, and how we can help you be successful in the exam, right? Before I get to the next part, which I said is more in terms of to give you a flavor of how we, how our classes are going to be. Let me take a pause, right? And then please feel free to, give your questions and stuff, guys. Um, Again, right? I think Kayur, honestly, man, I think at least in terms of this larger group, and probably at least I don't consider myself, right, per se qualified to give you an exact number, right, in terms of package per se. But as I said, again, if I am a hiring manager, again, having worked in places like EY and Cognizant, if I'm a hiring manager, I would definitely pay 30 to 40% more to someone who has done EA, right, than say someone who's done the graduation from the best of the colleges. You might look sharp. You might be knowing your accounting well and everything, presentable and whatever it takes. Again, right, depends on what role we are hiring as well. But because there's a huge market and clients who do US taxes out of India, I think EA will definitely help, right? And that will distinguish or say will sort of make you more stand out, right, compared to other graduates or other freshers per se. Manoj again, right? I think, see, honestly, Manoj, transfer pricing and M&A are, as you know, more complex topics, right, within taxes. And usually, right, even if you see, I worked in EA, EY, I have a lot of friends in Deloitte. Even after you do your certifications, right, even if you're a CPA and then you join one of these firms, you won't directly walk into one of these teams, right? The way it happens is, you build your domain, you work a lot on tax projects, simple projects first, and then the complex and stuff and all, depending on how your learning curve is, in terms of depending on how you picked up. There's a little bit of luck as well, in terms of sometimes we get into some of the projects you're looking to hire freshers and stuff. But obviously, right, I'm saying anything that relates to tax, right? Because EA lays you a very strong foundation per se. I don't want to sell it directly saying that if you do EA, you'll be working 5 years down the line in M&A, right? I don't know about that, honestly, right? But if you do EA and then you are in a place where they work on mergers and acquisitions as well, consider this, right? All the tax matters in depth. You hopefully would have done a lot of tax work by then. You probably have become a tax head yourself, kind of stuff, right? And then obviously you will get into, depending on your appetite, depending on your learning curve, opportunities, you might get into more complex areas per se. So guys, I'm still fine that we overshot a little bit in terms of the time I wanted to spend on this section, but I do realize probably this is more rewarding for you in terms of why you're attending the session today. I don't mind taking a couple more questions, right, before we get into the next section. But again, just remember, right, any of the questions you might have later as well after today's class, please feel free to email them. You have your contacts in terms of how to reach out to us, any of our team. So please feel free to do that, and we will definitely help you clarify your questions, any doubts you have, and kind of stuff, right? But again, overall, right, I think definitely worth the investment per se. Depends on where you are in your career and stuff like that. But a lot of questions have come today, at least in terms of freshers. Honestly, right, for me, again, if I'm a fresher, I didn't know about EA, honestly, right, till I got into EY. And I already got registered myself for a CPA by then, based on my first job, within the first 2 years. I would have probably started with EA, right? Honestly, again, as I said, quick turnaround, lesser investment, and definitely in terms of how the job market scenario is in India per se, right? That's the overall thing. And please do feel free to reach out to us even after the class. If there are no more questions, guys, please, if you have anything on whatever we covered right now, do let me know. I hope we still have most of the people, yeah. And next an hour or so, right? Little bit more than hour. We'll definitely wrap up by 11 a.m. India time. Next hour and 10 minutes, we can look at one of the tax topics, right? To give you again a flavor per se. Okay, I take it like I take it like there were no more questions. Let's get into the topic per se, right? And again, we don't have to really cover. It's not that we are doing the main course here. We can always skip some part of it. I'm not too much worried about that. There are I've included at least, I don't know, right, 8 to 9 questions today, multiple choice questions as well, because that will help us to work them together. You'll get a sense in terms of how questions in EA sort of SCE exam sort of they get asked kind of stuff. So we'll get started, and then I'm sure we can I will sort of keep pausing as well, and then I'll take questions from you guys, right? So for today's session per se, right? Actually, I'm going to cover a topic called filing status, which is unique. That comes in the next slide, right? Which is very unique to US taxation, right? But even before we get there, I thought I'll give you very quick some bullet points in terms of how what about the US taxation, right? Because I may use some of these terms in the next 1 hour. I just wanted to make sure I think you sort of have a broad idea about it. Also, I could have started our course, right, if it was class 1 of EA course, and if we start it sooner than later, I would probably start off with I may start off with other parts in terms of what are the filing requirements. They've got a lot of numbers in terms of who should file, who are dependents, and kind of other informational stuff. But for today's class, I didn't want to go take a route, right, where it is more informational, all rules kind of stuff, all numbers, because that can get dry and you won't get a sense in terms of how we're going to do our classes, right? So I've selected filing status. Hopefully you'll find it interesting. But before that, very quickly, let's cover the basics, right? So a citizen or resident of US who is required to file a federal income tax return, right, will use form 1040. So you'll use this, probably you hear this term more frequently. The tax form which is used to file individual tax return is called 1040, right? 1040 is called 1040. And note the word federal, right? Again, one more unique thing about US is a person who has taxes, right? Who is sort of qualifies to pay taxes. He does it at 2 levels, right? One, he pays his income taxes. I'm talking about income tax. He pays it to the federal government, that is the central government as we call it. He also pays to the state government, right? The state where he resides in, right? Sort of domicile and stuff and all. Mainly we're going to talk about federal, right? And most of the course also is centered around federal course, federal taxation per se. Okay. And there are other filing requirement, guys, but just as an introduction to the topic, right? I'll get to the question after we complete the slide. When you need to file a tax return, obviously there is a threshold in terms of how much you are earning, right? How much taxpayer is earning for that particular year. They also have a criteria in terms of age, whether someone is 65 years, less than 65, or 65 or more, right? 2 categories. Younger than 65 or 65 or more, 2 different categories, right? Depending on that, the numbers change in terms of your standard deduction per se, or basically then when you need to file your taxes kind of stuff, right? And then the filing status, which I said is very unique because that depends on the family status per se, right? In terms of whether someone is married, unmarried, whether they are taking care of some dependents, in terms of in terms of bearing more than 50% cost of the dependents, etc., which you're going to see, right? But that's another unique thing because filing status does affect a lot of things on the tax return per se, right? And then again, we are not going to cover them today, but form 1040, if it is a very straightforward tax scenario, just one form will do. It has got certain schedules in terms of, I'm not going to cover them today, but if someone gets interest income, if someone is having capital gains in terms of they have some stock and they have sort of sold it in the stock market, they need to report that, right? Either gains or losses. In addition to that, if the form is more complex, say someone has a business running a sole proprietorship and runs a business, or someone has any income from royalties or rents. There are other schedules, right? Numbered schedules, schedule 1 to 3, 1, 2, and 3. But again, I think these are things that we'll see later in some of the classes, right? But I just wanted to give you a broad overview. And again, just remember that in India, the fiscal year is different, but in US, most of the individuals, right, they use calendar year. In fact, even most of the corporations, they use calendar year as a tax year, right, which is mainly Jan 1st to December 31st. So for them, especially for individual taxes, for 1040s, the filing deadline is April 15th, right? Again, it changed for this year because of COVID, but generally, right, every year it is April 15th of the following year. You need to file your taxes, file your tax return and pay your taxes, right? So for the year 19, for example, or for the year 2020, you need to file your tax 1040 by April 15th, 2021. Okay, so before we get into filing status, I see someone has already raised a question. Okay, so federal is more of a central government, right? So the kind of tax structure they have, they're more, states have more powers in US in terms of each state can determine their own thing, right? If you see right now, some states have already opened up their economies after lockdown, right? While federal government hasn't really has given any particular guideline per se, right? So state is state level. So if you're living in New York or Texas or New Jersey, there's a state that determines the rules and the taxes and a lot of stuff. And then federal government is basically central government, right? At a US level, right? What we call central government is called federal in US. Hope that answers your question, Arya. Okay. Okay, so that's more like a broad overview, guys. I probably would have covered it a little too fast, but again, right, because that is not the main topic for today. I was just trying to give you overall view, right, before we get into the topic of the day. But do let me know, right, or I don't know, right, if you want to wait for one more, two slides more, do let me know in case you want me to adjust my pace, right? If it is fast, let me know. If you want me to, if it is too slow, again, do let me know, guys, in terms of pace. I can always adjust, and accelerate or reduce my speed as required, okay? Okay, so filing status, right? Again, it's very interesting, concept. So every taxpayer, right, if you're filing a 1040, you are required to specify or choose, right, select a filing status. It doesn't mean you have choice always, depending on the criteria, depending on what you qualify for. In case you qualify for two different statuses, obviously you can choose, right, between which one, those two, right? But overall, there are 5 filing statuses we're going to see in a moment. But someone needs to either qualify, one, they need to qualify, and two, you need to select that particular filing status to pay or to file your taxes, right? And why it is important? It pretty much impacts everything, right? It impacts the numbers on the tax return. Example, what is the standard deduction, right? Or say the amount that one can reduce from their total taxable income, total gross income, rather. So that basically determines whether you need to file a tax return or not, right? So it impacts the standard deduction. It impacts whether you qualify for certain other deductions. They're very interesting credits, right? The benefits in US you can get while filing your taxes. If you are supporting a kid and then there is a loan on their education, there is some deduction that you can claim, right, in terms of the interest that you're paying on that education loan, right? Or you'll get some credits in terms of if you have qualified children, right? Again, there are certain rules. But just the fact that you have children, a taxpayer has children, and he qualifies otherwise for one or two other rules, he gets a credit, right? And that depends on the number of children, right? So if he has 3 kids, or 2 kids, he sort of can multiply X number of dollars into number of kids, right? And he can get that credit, right? So there are a lot of credits, deductions, or other benefits, and all those depends on which filing status one sort of is specifying and one qualifies, right? That is importance of the filing status. Again, there are broadly 5 filing state categories, right? One is single. Single is again, we'll cover that later. Let me see. Okay, let me just name off all the 5, right? One is single. One is if someone is married, both the spouses can choose to file jointly. This is where the choice comes in. Someone is married as on end of the tax year, say December 31st of tax year. Both the spouses can choose to file jointly, or one of them can choose to file separately, which will force the other spouse also to file separately, right? So you have a married couple, they can either file jointly, that is both of them can file one tax return, or both of them need to file two separate returns, right? There's nothing but married filing jointly or married filing separately. Then there are a couple of unique statuses, filing status. We'll look at those status separately, but mainly remember, right, these are certain status that IRS has recognized, and they want to give certain tax breaks or benefits to a unmarried single person who is also taking care of someone else, right? It can be their dependents, it can be their children, kind of stuff, right? Or there was a married couple and one of the spouses died or passed away. Then as a surviving spouse, there are certain other rules, right, in terms of how you can file, how you can select this particular filing status. Again, why it is important? Again, right, some of these, right, for example, head of household or qualifying widower or surviving spouse, they have better tax rates than a single, right? In fact, qualifying widow or surviving spouse is as good as a married filing jointly, which is the most, what do you say? This is the best status to file in terms of your numbers, right? In terms of lesser tax rates, higher deductions, a lot of credits and kind of stuff, right? So you'll get to know more about that today in today's class, as well as when we do the review later. So before I get started with single, right, and we'll now look at each of these filing statuses. And once I complete single and married, we're going to have some questions. We're going to answer some 3-4 questions before we get to the next 2 special status, right? But I just want to take a pause here. We are halfway into our session. Please let me know if if you have any questions, guys. Okay, I take it as there are no questions. So let's cover single and married, right? Both the options in married, and then we will probably we'll get to the questions, right? Okay, before that, there's a question. So Arya, for your question, right? So the teaching will happen from Simandar, right? And the material and the collaboration is happening with Fast Forward Academy. So basically, the review material is coming from them, the practice exams and kind of stuff. But we have a collaboration. Simandar is an educational institution, right? So we have collaboration with Fast Forward, and we do the teaching, right? Using the Fast Forward Academy material per se. Okay, so let's start with the most simpler, right? The most simplest of the filing status, which is single, right? The main thing about single is this is an unmarried guy, right? Either the taxpayer was never married, and then if he was married, he or she was married, then that person is legally separated by end of the tax year, right? So the benchmark, right, or what you see in terms of your criteria is what is the status as on December 31st of your tax year, right? Stuff. Yeah, I think there are couple of more questions I missed, guys. We'll get to it in the next time when we take a break, please. Don't mind, right? So starting with single, right? Again, as I said, this is an unmarried person, or if he was married earlier, as on December 31st, they are legally separated, right? That person is legally separated as per the state law, right? And there are 2 different ways, again, just to remember, because this is more of a US context. They could have been separated based on a order, right, of divorce, Decree is nothing but an order. Either they have a divorce order, or they have something called separate maintenance, right? Either decrees would mean that the taxpayer is legally separated and hence is single now, right? He might have been married earlier, but now as on December 31st, if this decree is there, then he's considered single, right? Or before the year began, right? So previously, in previous years, the taxpayer was widowed, so he lost his spouse and did not remarry. In the current tax year, by December 31st, again he is a single, right? But in one sentence, right? If I can say, single is going to be basically anyone who does not qualify for any other statuses, right? So one, he's not married, that is already established. So he'll not be able to file either jointly or separately with his spouse, right? So those two are out of question. And as an unmarried guy, if he qualifies for those two special statuses, we talked about head of household or surviving spouse, he wouldn't file single anyway, right? Because they're more beneficial. So if he's unmarried, doesn't qualify for other special statuses, he obviously is going to be single, right? So this is more like a catch-all or a default kind of filing status, right? So that's all single is. Again, in terms of favorability, this is the least favorable status per se, right? Not that you can do anything about it, but obviously if you're unmarried, someone is unmarried and he doesn't qualify in terms of other status, he has to go for single. Now, if someone, what is married filing jointly, right? I think I've covered it already. So if we have a married couple and they have a choice, right? Either they can both file their taxes together or separately. So married filing jointly is, who is eligible for that is if someone, or if the spouses both, right? They are married as on December 31st of the tax year, right? And note, right? This is the important thing. It doesn't require that both the spouses live together, right? At the end of the tax year, right? The qualification is not that as on December 31st, both the spouses should live together in under one roof or in one state or one home, whatever. But the requirement is that they should be married. The status should be married, right? There's another way to qualify for this is there is again a couple, there's a married couple and one of the spouses unfortunately sort of died during the tax year and the taxpayer did not remarry at the end of tax year, then obviously you can still file jointly, right, for that particular year. In the tax year, if the death happens for one of the spouse, the remaining spouse can still file jointly for that particular tax year, right? If he or she doesn't remarry as on December 31st of the tax year, right? And the last, one more extension to this rule is, again, if there's a married couple and one of the spouses dies before the next year filing deadline, right? So again, consider for the 2020 tax year, if one of the spouses dies before April 15th, 2021, the surviving person, right, the person who is alive, he can still choose to file jointly for the year 2020, right? Either in the tax year or before April 15th of the next year. If one of the spouses dies, the other dependent, the surviving spouse can still file jointly. Remember this, surely this is one of the questions that usually comes up, right? In terms of when someone can go for married filing jointly. Again, we're not going to cover too much in detail in today's session for sure. But as I said, and we'll look at it when we get into income and deductions, married filing jointly status will open up a lot of advantages, right? In terms of the limits, in terms of how much deduction someone can claim, what are the credits one can claim for their children and kind of stuff, right? So it's a very beneficial status, right? Other than low tax rates, obviously. We don't have to cover in too much of depth for today's class, but again, right, additional requirements for married filing jointly. Obviously, right, you're going to combine the returns of two people into one, right? Both are using the same tax return. It makes sense that both spouses use the same tax year, right? So both of them should have Jan 1st to December, which is usually what they have. Or even if you choose a different tax year, it has to be different from Jan to December. It has to be same for both people, right? Say April 1st to March 31st, right? Even if the tax year chosen by the MFJ status is that the requirement here is that both spouses use the same tax year, right? Um, and neither of the spouse is a non-resident alien, right? Sounds very heavy, but simply non-resident alien is someone is who is not a US citizen, right? So he's a foreign national and not living in US, right? Non-resident, non-living in US, alien to them, anyone outside US, right? So basically foreign national. So out of this, if there is a married couple, if say one person is not a US citizen, say he or she is in Europe, working there, right, residing outside US as well as citizen of a different country, then usually they cannot file married filing jointly, right? Just taking a step back, right? Like in all regulation papers or in taxes, there's always a general rule and there is always an exception, right? If I am teaching, especially that's how I learned. I think we should learn the general rule first, which applies for 80 to 90%, and then there is always an exception, right? Make sure we always understand the general rule, and the exception will always be there for every rule, right? So for this particular rule, an exception is that the couple can choose, right? For example, again, I talked about a scenario where one person is working, say, living US citizen, living in New York, working there, and then her husband, say, works in Paris, and he's a French citizen. Now the person living in US can choose to file jointly if the spouse in Paris, right, also agrees to be treated as a US as a US resident, right? For that, what will happen? Entire taxable income of both the spouses will be represented in one tax return, right? They have to see whether it's beneficial or not. Sometimes people go for it, right? Depending on their particular scenario. So even in case of non-resident alien, the exception I'm talking about is if they agree, right, to choose treating the non-resident alien as a US resident, then they can still file jointly, but that would mean they are reporting their whole worldwide income, right, of both the spouses together on one tax return. Again, we can see that particular specific scenarios. We can look at it, more in depth later when we cover in this topic, right? Before I go to the question, the last more important provision for married filing jointly is both spouses must sign the tax return, right? And why is it important? Is basically when two people are filing one single return, they are jointly and individually, right, collectively and individually liable for the taxes that are due on that particular tax return, right? Doesn't matter if one of the spouses is just earned 10% of the whole income or even 0%, right? Again, so there is A and B, married couple, they're filing tax returns. Say A has 100% of income, right? B is just filing jointly along with A, right? They're filing jointly. It is possible. However, in terms of being liable for paying taxes on that particular return, B is equally liable as A, right? So both of them together are collectively and individually liable to pay taxes. So again, right, what is the repercussion or impact of this? If someone, right, for whatever reason, right, one of the spouses is not sure that the other spouse is reporting everything transparently, they're not hiding, or if they're hiding anything, then they might always choose to file separately, right? So one spouse files separately, obviously the other person also has to file separately, right? So more importantly, they need to sign the return together, right? This is married filing jointly, guys. And MFS, let me just do this slide quickly, right? And then I'll take the question. I'll pause before we go to the quiz questions, right? Married filing separately is very, very simple, right? Married couple is there. They're not filing jointly, as I talked in the end of the last slide. Then what will they do? They will file separately, right? In this particular case, each spouse, right, is responsible for his or her own income, deductions, credits, etc., right? You are filing taxes for yourself. Obviously, you'll be responsible only for what you are claiming on your tax return, right? There is something like community property estate, but I wouldn't get there. I'll be able to explain that in 2 minutes. But again, right, it's an exception. very peculiar to US. Just understand that in community property state, usually there's no benefit filing separately, right? Um, yeah, let me not cover that, currently, right? Let me take this question at least, and then we'll get to community property in case you guys want. Absolutely, man. It's very interesting, right? The married status, and again, depending on the socio-economic status, right? Think about it. Again, look at again my narrative, right? It's not nothing to do with EA exam. Look at what's happening in Europe, what's happening in US, right? Some of the disadvantaged sections, right, where most of the deaths are happening due to COVID, is actually the care homes, right, where the senior and differently abled citizens are sort of taken care of. These homes, these where most of the deaths are happening, right? Because again, most of them are so that's sort of kind of a situation, right? A social situation in US or in West, where they probably the intent of the law is to encourage taxpayers to take care of their people, right? It happens naturally in some countries and some probably doesn't. So the intent is, if someone is married, they have kids, they're going to get more credits for that. Just having kids is allowing them to reduce their taxes. Surely they can't introduce that in India, I'm sure. And if someone is taking care of their parents as well, right? Even if they're living separately, we're going to see that he is going to get some certain deductions, right? There's specific filing status for that. So it's mainly to encourage people to be a good citizen, so to say, to speak largely, broadly, right? That's what happens. And then married filing separately, guys, if it's going to rackle your brain, uh, if you don't understand it, it's fine, right? But just to cover community property states is again very interesting thing. What happens in US? There are 9 states, right? Out of 51 in US, there are 51 states. Out of that, in 9 states, right? Definitely a minority. The way these states have enacted their tax provisions, their property rules, they specifically mandate, right, that if there is a married couple and they have earned income, right, during the year, right, one of them could have earned, both of them could have earned, in these particular states, even if the couple is filing separately, right, all the income, all the expenses, everything gets allocated equally between both the spouses. Same thing happens to property as well, right? Both of them, if they earn any property after marriage in these particular states, both of them collectively own that, say 50%, right? Jointly own that property, right? Little specific rule to sort of specific states. You don't have to get bogged down right now, but mainly why it got covered in MFS is it makes a lot more sense for spouses living in states other than community property states, right? That those are called separate property states. That's where it makes sense to file separately, right? Otherwise, anyway, if you are reporting everything 50%, there might not be too much of benefit in married filing separately in community property state per se, right? So that's the interesting thing about this particular state. So if you guys are ready for trying some of the questions, please. Yeah, again, before that, right, I think, Nisag, you had a couple of questions. I didn't see this window earlier. Yes, it's going to be 80 hours for all the 3 parts. But as I said, um, we are pretty much flexible, right? I think if we really need to, if we complete it earlier, nothing like it, we can definitely do more review, do some questions together. If we think we are taking more time, we can always increase the duration of each class, probably take classes on holidays as well. We can, we usually take a vote among our participants or our students and schedule our classes, right? So yeah, we'll see how it goes. But overall, right, again, as I said, the rule of thumb is EA exam takes around 150 hours. So half of it, we can do it together during these classes, and another half, you can prepare on your own, take your questions, you answer MCQs and stuff like that, right? It actually doesn't have to take 150, probably it is even 100 or 120, but maximum, right, even if it takes 150, at least 50% we are doing it together within the classes, right? And we're covering everything. So basically, when I say matching contribution, I'm expecting that you guys will also review it once at home, right, after we do the class per se. So that's how my math came up with. Course fee, right? Please let me park this question. I don't know if I have it top of my head, guys. If you haven't heard about it earlier, let me please have one of our admins email it to you, right? Or share it with you separately after the exam, after the class today, please. Yeah, I don't think I know honestly, right? I don't know uh, the final course fee that that has been finalized per se, right? But definitely we'll share that with you. I know this important information, Nito, right? Okay, guys. So let's please give your best, right? Again, today I don't expect you to give correct answers, but based on whatever you have heard, based on whatever I have explained, please give your shot, right? Okay. Um, Sorry, where are we? Okay, so we have Gina and George, right? So there's a married couple here, and they have visited tax preparer. Say they visited you, and you inform them that if they file separately, they will have a lower combined tax than if they file jointly, right? Now, Gina and George have been married for 10 years. They've always filed jointly, right? Last 10 years, they've been filing jointly. Now, what are the options they have? And you have, as an enrolled agent or as a tax consultant, you told them to file separately this year, right? That are given in the case facts, right? In the question. Now, what options do you have? Do they have an option at all to file separately? Or do they just have to file jointly, right? First one says, no, they can't file separately. They have to file jointly itself. Second option says, they can file separately this year, but they should then continue to file separately going forward, right? In future years as well. Three, they can file separately this year and may file either jointly or separately in future years. And fourth, they must file separately, right? So take a guess, guys. What do you think? There's a married couple, married for 10 years. They've always filed jointly. What do you think will happen this year, right? What can they do? What are the choices they have got? Any guesses from you guys? Okay, I got option 3 from one of the participants. One more. Yes, guys. I think you got it correct, right? So I know I didn't specifically cover that earlier while discussing MFJ and MFS filing jointly and separately. There is no, so it's very flexible, right? There's nothing written in stone that if you file jointly for historically, then you always have to do that going forward as well. So there is flexibility for each and every year, right? There's a married couple, they can always choose whether to file jointly or separately. Okay. So in this particular situation, if their tax consultant, right, they have asked them to file separately this year, they can definitely file separately this year. And in going forward, they can always choose whether they can file jointly or separately, right? The decision to file jointly or separately in 1 year does not impact what's going to happen going forward, right? That's the main, take away from this question per se. Obviously, historically as well, right? There's nothing like, what's happening. All of you got your answer right, guys. Great. So next one, right? So Joan and Marlena, right? They were married several years ago, and have lived together since that time. They have no children. On December 29th of the prior year, they were granted a decree of separate maintenance, and they moved into 2 separate apartments. In January, Marlena came to you to advise her on filing her income tax return for the prior year, right? So the tax year is the prior year, right? And in that particular year, on December 29th, right, 3 days before the year ended, they were granted a decree. Remember, we covered this, right? So there was an order given by the court of separate maintenance, right? Now that happened. I know we haven't covered one of the statuses here, but ignoring that, right? Tell me, what do you think uh, is going to be the advice of the tax consultant, right? It's all given in terms of they have been married, they're a married couple. However, on December 29th, there was a decree granted, and they are living separately, right? So first question, right? Do you think they are married as on end of the year, or do they can Do they can they choose anything between MFJ or MFS, married filing jointly or separately? Just answer this question, right? Can they do they have a choice of married filing jointly or separately? Take a guess, it's fine. Okay, someone gave one of the options. Okay, someone gave another option. Okay, let me help you with that, right? So remember, guys, the rule, right, in terms of the status that IRS looks for, it doesn't care what's happening throughout the year, right? Something might happen in Jan, during mid-year, something might change again in terms of marital status. But what is the marital status as on December 31st of the filings of the tax year, right? That becomes important for your filing status. And in this particular question, remember that on December 29th, they were granted a divorce or separate maintenance decree, right? So based on that, they are not married, right? They are not considered married at all. So these two options go out of window, right? They cannot file either jointly or separately because they're not married as on December 31st. The other two options then remain single or head of household. There's no information regarding anything else regarding head of household, right? So let's just ignore that. For this particular question, the answer is single, right? In terms of you can only advise them to go for single. They might qualify as head of household, but for that you need separate information. We can look at that information in the subsequent slides. Okay, is that clear, guys? They're not married at all, right? So these two are out of question, and so the catch-all category, right? Single status becomes sort of a default filing status. Any questions on that? Okay, I take it that you guys have understood that. Unmarried, so they can't go for any of these, so they'll go for single, right? Okay, so the last question we have, right? And some of these questions are again covered after we complete the special status as well. But one more question before we get into the special situations, right? So Anne and Jim have been separated for 2 years as of December 31st. Although they reconciled and lived together during the month of October, whatever, right? 4. They have never obtained a separate maintenance agreement or filed for divorce, right? I would underline this. Okay. So they are married couple, but they're living separately, and they have never obtained a separate maintenance agreement or filed for divorce. They have 2 children who live full time with Anne, okay, and qualify as her dependents. What filing status must Anne use? Again, guys, I know we haven't covered head of household, right? But consider what is their status, right? Let's look at marital status first. What is their marital status as of December 31st of 2004, right? Based on that, I think you can eliminate a lot of other things and you can only go for, and then that gives you choice, right? In terms of what your answer is. Can you take a guess, guys? Okay, I got option 4, and 4 and D, and everyone is giving the same option, right? And I completely agree, right? So that is the correct answer based on whatever information we have that is given to us, right? Because remember, guys, as on December 31st of that particular year, doesn't matter if they're living separately, right? I told you it's not a rule that they have to live under same roof, right? And doesn't matter whether they're reconciled or whatever. Also, right? The main important thing is they never obtained there's no decree, right, of divorce or maintenance. Separate, there's no maintenance decree, or there's no separate maintenance decree, there's no divorce decree, right? So irrespective of whether they're reconciled, whether they're living together or in 2 different homes, to me they're married as on 31st December of that particular tax year, right? So they can go either from MFJ or married filing separately. Just remember, right, again, not to bog you down, remember there's always an exception in taxes, right? As with all rules. So in this particular scenario, while I'm not going to cover in depth for today's class, is there is some special rule called abandoned spouse rule, right? Again, that might not come here. So let's just leave it, guys. I think that rule will come again later in one of the other questions, right? So for this, let's just have a clear answer of married filing jointly or married filing separately because they're already married. Okay. So before we go to the next two statuses, right? The last two statuses we already covered: single, which is like a catch-all category. Someone is unmarried, has got no other strings, not helping any other dependent, not helping maintain household for anyone else. He's a single, right? uh, One guy, happy guy, whatever. And then there are married couple. They have a choice of filing jointly if they meet certain requirements, which we have seen, or they can file separately, right? That's again a choice, all right? And we have seen that it is important the marital status to determine what is the status as on last day of the tax year, right? Okay. Now, before we go to special situations, based on this and the questions we have seen, please let me know if you guys have any questions, please. Right. So if they are separated, right, then they are unmarried, right, Madhu? So if they're unmarried, obviously they can't file either married filing jointly or married filing separately, right? Then it comes to in terms of this person has a children and then what she qualifies for that. Let's review the other information, right? Because we're talking about Anne and who is already maintaining a couple of children. Anne is maintaining a couple of children, right? So head of household comes into play, honestly. But for that, let's see the rules in terms of what exactly is head of household. Okay. But in the correct, but in the particular question, because they're not separately, they're not separated. They're married. Their status is still married. They can either jointly or separately file their returns, right? Okay. Now, what is in very simply, right? What are these special situations, guys? Basically, again, right? IRS wanted to give for certain people, right, who are unmarried or single, right? Again, underline that. Not for married folks. If someone is unmarried or single, to them, they wanted to give equally same benefits as a married filing jointly or something more than single, right? They wanted to make it, they wanted to create some special filing statuses to certain guys, right? If they are unmarried or single. And when does it happen? And what are those statuses? We're going to look now, right? Let's look at head of household first, and then we'll look at qualifying widow, right? Or in fact, let me just try something out, right? Let's look at qualifying widow first, guys, because that's very much related to married filing jointly, right? And then we'll come to head of household, right? Okay, let me take you to who is qualifying widow or widower, right? So this status is also called, referred to as surviving spouse, right? Again, this is nothing but we have already seen or discussed this situation while talking about married filing jointly. The situation comes up when there is a married couple and one of the spouse, right? One of the spouses died, in one of the previous two tax years, right? Not in that tax year, not in that particular tax year, but in the previous two tax years. And the taxpayer, right? That is a survivor, surviving spouse, did not remarry before the end of the current tax year. All right. Let's just pause here, right? Let's just look at this particular thing. Two things. One, we know that for qualifying widower, one should not be married, right? Obviously, right? In that sense, so he should not remarry or should not have a new spouse as on December 31st, right? Then he'll not be qualifying for this. He'll have this other rule of either he has a new person as a couple, as a spouse. So both the new spouses can decide whether they can do MFJ or whatever, right? That's the thing. But if he doesn't remarry, right? He or she doesn't remarry, but end of the tax year, and one of his spouse, his or her spouse has died during that particular tax year. We have already covered that earlier, right? Do you guys remember what will happen in the same tax year, right? If one of the spouses dies, what the surviving spouse can do? If you guys remember, any of you remember, please? Okay, in the paucity of time, right? If you guys remember, I mentioned if one of the spouses died during the tax year or even before April 15th of the following year, right? Before the filing return of the following year, the surviving spouse can still file jointly. Okay, as long as he does not marry remarry, right? As long as the surviving spouse does not remarry as on December 31st, right? So when does a qualifying widower come in? It for the subsequent 2 years. So again, right, 2020, one of the spouses died. The surviving spouse did not marry as on December 31st, 2020. But 2020, he can still file, he or she can still file jointly, right? For 21 and 22, the subsequent 2 years, they can, the surviving spouse can choose to file as qualifying widow or widower because they are eligible for that. And they can do that as long as they do not remarry, and the taxpayer should have a child or a stepchild. Okay, it can be own child or a stepchild, doesn't matter, but it does not include a foster child, right? Again, a concept not sort of little alien to India. Foster child is someone who is a temporarily being taken care, right, in a different home, but because it's a temporary relationship per se, foster child does not qualify for giving the taxpayer status of qualifying widow, right? So as long as the surviving spouse does not marry and has a child or stepchild whom he can claim, right? The taxpayer can claim as dependent or could have claimed as dependent, right? And there are certain exceptions. We look at that. Basically, they become eligible for qualifying widow, right? In the 2 subsequent years. Again, look at the scenario 2020, one of the spouses died. The surviving spouse for that particular year anyway can file jointly. In 21 and 22, they'll be qualified to file as qualifying widow or widower as long as they have a child or a stepchild, right? And does not, first thing is they don't remarry, they have a child or a stepchild, and that particular child, these are the exceptions, right? The child should not have gross income more than 4,200, right? Whatever type of income, right? The child, he might be working in summer, he might be even delivering newspapers for whatever you think, right? Or he might have unearned income, right? Interest or dividends, right? Any of these, as long as it is less than 4,200, he is still eligible. If that child has got more than 4,200, then you cannot, the taxpayer is not eligible to file as a qualifying widower, right? Or the child itself is married. We're not talking about, whatever, right? Very young child here. So obviously child himself is married and filed a joint return. Then obviously, the taxpayer cannot file as qualifying widower. Or the taxpayer himself is getting claimed as a dependent on someone else's return. Again, I know guys, dependent we haven't covered in today's session. It all is sort of has got set of numbers in terms of who can be claimed as dependents. We'll do that, whenever when our course starts. Usually that is in session 2. But just remember, the taxpayer himself is getting claimed as dependent on someone else's return. He cannot be qualified as he will not qualify to file as a qualifying widower. Okay. So simply this is, think about it, right? Again, the logic is someone has lost, there's a married couple and one spouse has lost the other. Then this is still giving the benefit, extended benefit for the couple more years, right? That particular year they can still file jointly, the surviving spouse. Next 2 years as well, as long as the person is not remarrying and has a child, with certain exceptions, they are able to file as qualifying widower. And few more conditions, very very sensible conditions, right? Is the child lived in the taxpayer's home all the tax year, right? This qualifying child should have been living in the taxpayer's home. Obviously then the taxpayer has paid over the half of the cost of keeping up taxpayer's home. The child should not be contributing more than 50%. All right. So taxpayer must be paying more than half the cost of maintaining that particular home, right? Upkeep or keeping up the taxpayer's home. And the taxpayer should have been eligible filing for jointly, right? In the year of taxpayer's spouse death. Again, we talked about 2020, the spouse died. So the surviving spouse should have been eligible to file for MFGA, right? Irrespective of whether he has filed MFGA or not, as long as he's eligible to file jointly in that particular year, this condition is met. Okay, doesn't matter if actually he filed separately. That's okay, as long as the surviving spouse is eligible to file jointly. This condition is met in that particular year. Okay. Again, right, this is something that I've repeated multiple times in this particular screen. Usually there is a question around this as well. So if the taxpayer's spouse died in the current year, he cannot file as a qualifying widow, right? Um, I'll ask you later, right, in terms of what should be he filing at. So these are the simple question, guys. And basically, again, look at it as IRS is trying to extend the same benefit, right? Lower tax rates, giving them more credits and stuff and all for 2 more years, even after, one of the spouses died in case of a married couple. Okay, that is a qualifying widower. Let's take one or two questions, right? And then I'll pause and I'll take questions, guys. Um, let's start with this, right? Or what is a simpler one, guys? Let me just see. Um, yeah, let's start with this, right? There are three questions. We'll go for all the three. Um, look at this question, right? So Mr. and Mrs. M, right, have been married for several years and have one child who lives at home and is their dependent, right? A lot of good things are given in the first two sentences, right? First two lines. So they've been married for several years. They have one child. That person is living in their home and is a dependent. Okay. Now Mrs. M died suddenly during February, say 21. Okay. Now Mr. M does not remarry prior to the end of 21. That is that particular tax year. He did not remarry. What filing status should he use filing for income taxes in that particular year? So we're talking about the same year, guys, not subsequent years. During the tax year, one of the spouses died. Then what can he file for that particular year, please? D. I have an answer from Manoj. And anyone else, guys? Okay, I think Manoj, you're correct, right? So if you remember, guys, I think I have sort of mentioned it multiple times, right? During the tax year, if one of the spouses dies, the surviving spouse can still file as married filing jointly, right? For that particular tax year. And remember, not just for that particular tax year, right? Before the filing date next year as well, right? So even if say one of the spouses has died, um, the following year before April 15th, still for the tax year, the surviving spouse can file as jointly, right? And in the subsequent years, obviously other rules will come in, right? But for the same year, they have to file as jointly, which we've definitely covered earlier. That's correct, right? So basically, he did not marry. Madhu and Manoj, both of you got it correct. The person, the surviving spouse, did not remarry, and it happened in the same year, in the tax year the death happened. So for that particular year, the surviving spouse, that is Mr. M in this particular case, can still file jointly, right? He doesn't have to bother about whether the child is there, whether he qualifies for qualifying widower or not, right? Quite simple. In fact, he cannot file for that particular year, right? He can only file qualifying widow for subsequent years if he qualifies. Now look at a bit more broader, right? Similar scenario. In again 21, Nancy's husband died. They have 3 children, 2 of whom were still dependents. Okay, Nancy does not remarry, and the 2 children remain as a dependents, living with her until 2025. So guys, look at it, right? We're talking about 4 years, right? There's a tax year, and then we have covered a few more years, subsequent years, right? Now, what is the filing status for the federal income tax purposes? I know we haven't covered head of household, so leave that. She's qualifying widow for years, the tax year, right? 21 to 24. She's a qualifying widow for 22 and 23, and head of household for 24, or she's a qualifying widow for 21 and head of household for 22 to 24. Okay, guys, I think for this particular one, right? Because it's talking about subsequent years, right? Honestly, let's and it has got head of household. We'll look at this question after we cover head of household, right? There's a similar question. I thought, right? Just give me a minute, please. Don't mind. Yeah, I think this is the one, right? This is one, right? Okay. Bob and Rita, they are a married couple here, right? And Bob died on October 1st of the current tax year. Okay. Now, Bob's two children, right, lived with the couple full time. The children will continue to live with Rita after Bob died, right? What filing status should Rita use in the year of death and subsequent years in which the unmarried children continue to live with her, right? So consider the facts again, right? There is a tax year. In that particular tax year, one of the spouses has died, and then we have a scenario of surviving spouse, right? She has also got two children, 6 and 8, right? Young children, and they are living in the same house with the surviving spouse, and full time, right? They continue to live with these guys, right? And they're unmarried, obviously. So the question here is, we don't even have to look at the options, right? I won't even look at the options, guys. Tell me what the surviving spouse can use, right? What filing status she can use, Rita in this particular case, for the tax year and for the subsequent years, right? After the 2 subsequent years after the tax year. Yeah, we got an answer, guys. Absolutely right. I think, guys, always remember again, right? This is what we covered just now. The surviving spouse should file married filing jointly in the year of death, right? Because the tax year, one of the spouses passed away, the other spouse has to still file married filing jointly. Then in this particular case, you already know that she's, Rita is eligible to file as qualifying widow for the 2 subsequent years, right? 2 years after the tax year, because she has got 2 children. They didn't talk about whatever children they are. We have to assume they are children, right? Their own kids or stepchildren, it's fine. There's no exceptions in terms of foster child. So they have children, they've lived with the couple full time, and they continue to stay in their house, and they're unmarried, right? So ticks off all the, there's a check on all the criteria. So Rita can file as qualifying widow for the next 2 years. Can she also file as head of household for subsequent years? We'll look at it, when we cover complete the head of household, right? So I think, guys, we are good to look at the last, last filing status, the 5th filing status as head of household, right? And I think there's a cutoff, guys. I got a message, right? Today, usually I would be very flexible in terms of extending the classes beyond the scheduled time. Today, I think the class is scheduled for 2 hours, and I guess there is, another session lined up after this. So in terms of logistics, there's a hard stop, right? So we'll stop it. I'll stop at 10:55 in the next 5 minutes, and then we'll sort of, there's an opportunity for you to ask more questions as well. And then, and obviously, I look forward to teaching this particular topic and individual taxation whenever our session, our course starts actually, right? Hopefully sooner. Okay, head of household is the last status, the leftover status we're going to cover now, guys. We have seen single, catch-all category for unmarried people. We have seen the 2 choices a married couple has, married filing jointly or married filing separately. We also have seen a scenario where there was a married couple, but one of the spouses died. Then what are the options the surviving spouse has, and when that person qualifies for a qualifying widow or widower status. The last status we have is head of household, right? Again, very broadly, this is a special filing status created. Obviously, they have created this because they want the intent of the tax, IRS is to give this particular status better benefits than a single guy. Okay, so this is for an unmarried person, but he's doing something better than what a single person is doing, right? And he cannot, obviously, if someone qualifies for this particular status, they can't file, they're not married, so they can't file MFJ or MFS, right? Jointly or separately. So what is this status all about, right? So this is again for unmarried individual. I'll underline that. Okay. Providing a home to certain qualifying persons, right? So what is he doing differently than a single person? He is unmarried, of course, but he is also taking responsibility of another qualifying person, right? So that is giving him better tax situation than a single person, right? And when is someone unmarried, this is pretty much opposite to what we have seen, right? In terms of who is married. So who is unmarried? If the taxpayer was legally separated according to the state law, right, under a decree of divorce or maintenance at the end of the tax year, we know already about that. So he is unmarried by then. As on December 31st, if they have a formal order, he is considered unmarried. If the taxpayer is married but was living apart from their spouse for the last 6 months, right? This is the exception I was talking about, guys. Even if they're married, there is a rule called abandoned spouse rule. Again, an exception. I wouldn't spend too much time for today's class, but an abandoned spouse can still claim head of household. If they meet all of the conditions, of head of household, right? Because that person is considered unmarried, for the tax purposes. And then the taxpayer is married to non-resident alien at any time during the year, and they do not choose to treat him or her as a resident alien. We've again discussed this earlier, remember? So one of the spouses is a resident of US, is also staying there, as a US citizen, and then one of the spouses is working elsewhere. Now they haven't choose to treat him as resident alien, so they're not filing jointly. Now the guy who is staying in US, he can go for head of household if he qualifies other conditions, right? Now, what are the other conditions? I'm not going to cover in detail, right? But just remember, there are a lot of people, right, who qualify. So one is that person, taxpayer, should be unmarried. We have seen that, and he should be maintaining the home for another qualifying person. And who is that qualifying person? There can be two categories, right? One is taxpayer's parents, and two, all others who are qualifying, right? This has been listed, so you just have to go through that list. Why parents are treated separately? Very simply is, parents do not have to live with taxpayer, right, to make him eligible for head of households category. So they might be staying in a home, they might be staying separately in a different home, or they might be taking care in special homes. That's fine, right? As long as the taxpayer is paying more than half the cost of maintaining that particular home, right, which is considered main home of the parent, he becomes eligible. Just remember that, okay? The parent does not have to stay with taxpayer, as long as if they are staying in a separate home, which is a main home for them, and taxpayer is maintaining that particular home, that is giving more than 50% expenses for that particular home, right? As long as it is done, if the taxpayer is maintaining that kind of home for parents, he'll become eligible for head of household. For all others, right? This is it. Basically, these are the set of people, guys. These are brothers, these are sisters, brother-in-law, sister-in-law. I'm not going to go through all the rules here because of the paucity of the time today. They are qualifying relatives, right? They're going to get you this particular status. And again, there are certain exceptions. Mainly, if there are children, they're not going to give you this exception, because in certain cases, children are going to give you qualification for other statuses anyway, right? They're probably giving you, qualification as a qualifying widower, or there might be more different rules in case of divorced parents. There are certain rules in terms of who is a custodial parent, who is non-custodial parent. So there are certain exceptions, but mainly, right, if there are a qualifying relative and they are living with the taxpayer in his own home, right, for more than half of the year, right, then taxpayer becomes eligible for head of household, right? So this is how it is different from parents. If the qualifying relatives of parents, they can live separately, still this guy qualifies as head of household. If there are non-parents but still are qualifying relatives, then he'll be eligible only if those guys stay, right? If those persons stay in taxpayer's home for more than half of the year, and taxpayer actually bears more than 50% of the cost of maintaining that particular home, right? there are other rules in terms of what is considered as 50%, what are the expenses and all, guys. But we can always look at it later, right? But I hope you guys got a flavor, right? Again, the intent of today's demo session is one, to give you idea about EA examination, what it takes, what we are going to support you with. I hope I covered all your questions. We covered it quite in detail based on your questions. The only question that I need to get back to you guys is in terms of the course fee, and I'll make sure that we pass it along to you. And then we also have taken I've taken a mini class where you guys have seen, right, and I've also answered some of the questions. It's going to be more interactive as well, our classes. It'll be less unhurried, honestly, because today's class I was trying to cover in 1 hour 10 minutes, right, the entire topic. But we can always be more flexible when we actually start the classes. And one thing that is going to remain common is we're going to work out together some of the examples, and we'll do a lot more MCQs, right? In today's class itself, at least there are 4 more questions that we could not answer today. But I think we'll be able to do that, when we do the classes, right? And you will also have access to a lot more other MCQs, which we can offline work on outside the class as well. So guys, those are all things that I wanted to cover today. Hope you found it useful. Let me know if you guys have any few parting questions, right? Yeah. So Madhu, right? I think very good question, right? So for the year of 20, we looked at the window in terms of, right, if someone is taking exam in 2021, right? I've showed you that. Remember, I showed you that examination schedule: August 2020, November 2020, and February 21. If you're going to take exam in 2021, then all the tax rules that apply for 2019 will be tested, right? So anything that happens with in the year 2020 will not be part of your exam, right? If you're going for the 2021 examination period. But rest assured, right? I think the broad question is, will we cover all the updates, both fast forward and Simandar, right? As a faculty, and as our partner, fast forward will update all the rules based on any developments or updates that happens, right, during the year, right? So we always cover those updates. But if you're taking 2021, then you just need to be aware of 2019 tax year rules. Hope that answers your question. Okay, thank you. Guys, any other final question, please? Okay, so thanks so much for your time today and for joining. Please feel free to shoot your questions, right? If you have anything offline as well, and we'll make sure we answer them, right? But otherwise, look forward to helping you pass your EA exam. So thanks so much again, guys. Happy Sunday. Bye bye.